Hey everyone, welcome to MintCast. I'm Manar Adli. President Nicolas Maduro is celebrating this week after a clear victory in the National Assembly elections that took place on December 6th. Helped by a partial opposition boycott of the process, the ruling socialist coalition led by Nicolas Maduro received over 69% of the votes cast and won a massive 253 of the 277 seats in the National Assembly, the only branch of government not under its control previously. While the government is celebrating, the low turnout of 31% has many worried its support is decreasing, although the vote was held in the middle of a pandemic. Now, the US government, who has long considered Venezuela an official enemy, decried the process before it even had begun, instructing opposition parties to boycott the election, even sanctioning those that disobeyed their orders. Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo took to Twitter to call Venezuela's elections illegitimate, describing Maduro as a dictator and a strong man, despite the fact that there were over 1,500 election observers and 300 representatives from 34 countries. Now, joining me today are four people who know the country very well: Max Blumenthal, Anya Parampil, Adrienne Pine, and Alan MacLeod. Now, Max is an award-winning journalist and author and editor of The Gray Zone, who has been reporting from Venezuela this week and observed the elections. His latest book is The Management of Savagery: How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. He is also the co-host of the Moderate Rebels podcast. Anya is a former producer and host for In Question at RT America, who now hosts and produces her own show, Red Lines, which you can find at The Gray Zone, YouTube, and other platforms. Adrienne is an associate professor of anthropology at the American University in Washington, D.C. In 2019, she occupied the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. to prevent it from falling into the hands of US-backed self-declared President Juan Guaido. Like Max and Anya, she observed the recent elections close up, traveling to Venezuela to be an election observer. Our fourth guest is Mint Press News senior staff writer Alan MacLeod. Alan is an expert in Western media coverage of South America. After completing his PhD on the topic in 2017, he published 5 peer-reviewed articles on how media distorts the image of Venezuela. He's also the author of the book Bad News from Venezuela: 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting. Welcome to the show, everyone. Max, I'd like to start with you. So you've been inside Venezuela for a while now, observing and reporting on the elections. Could you just give us an idea about what the atmosphere is like there, and perhaps things that surprised you or would surprise Americans if they were there in Venezuela?
Well, the atmosphere here has been more determined by the economic picture than the political situation, which is completely stable. Politically, the country's stable. There was a Wall Street Journal headline that was like a State Department press release on steroids, which said that Venezuela is sliding into chaos. And there's just simply no chaos here. Things are completely stable. And if anything, the security situation, including the situation for people, just common people, with respect to street crime, has improved. And it's something that people do credit the government with. The government here, and Nicolas Maduro, his legacy will be having defeated the civil war that the opposition, led by the US-backed arsonists of Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaido, tried to incite. He has defeated the civil strife. And of course, there's still polarization. But what we saw with the election was sort of a coming together around certain core issues that are central to the national survival of Venezuela, between Maduro's PSUV party and the what someone called the moderate opposition, but which I would call the patriotic opposition. And they came together around opposition to sanctions because they're hurting everybody on every level, and an opposition to the arsonist wing of the opposition, which is basically subsisting on a steady flow of US dollars and doing it whatever the United States wants. So we saw very significant developments with the election, where a number of mainstream opposition parties Democratic Action, COPE, which is based off it's kind of like the Christian Democratic Union of Venezuela, and the party of Henry Falcón, who is a major opposition figure, and a number of other parties participate in the elections despite threats from the United States, despite sanctions on opposition lawmakers. A former ally of Juan Guaido, who is has been the Speaker of the National Assembly, Luis Parra, was sanctioned by the U.S. State Department. And these opposition figures basically said, we don't care what the U.S. says. We are opposed to Maduro. Many of us support massive privatization, but we want the country to still exist. And we're sick of this wing of the opposition that only wants to tear down the entire country and have common Venezuelan people suffer in order to achieve their hysterical political aims. So I think that was the main outcome of the election. And yes, there was an opposition boycott. Juan Guaido, acting as a proxy of the United States, sought to depress turnout. The U.S. ran a voter suppression campaign. Guaido exploited COVID and everything else to tell people to stay at home. Turnout was 32%. And, considering that there are sanctions, considering there's a fuel crisis brought on by the U.S., considering that a wing of the opposition did not participate, it's not terrible when you think about U.S. midterm election results in 2010 or 1998. They were like 38%. So the opposition is still, the opposition is completely fractured. And I think the political situation is stabilized. We can talk about the economic situation too, because that's a really interesting development. But the election was a political victory as expected for Nicolas Maduro's PSUV.
And you talked a lot about the opposition and Juan Guaido and basically, taking advantage of the pandemic and so forth. Alan, I'd like to ask you about how Juan Guaido is depicted in U.S. media, and if you can give us kind of a glimpse of what he truly is up to in Venezuela.
Yeah, Juan Guaido told his followers not to participate in this election. He was going to boycott it. He even kind of hijacked a lot of the stay-at-home COVID hashtags that were around social media to tell people to stay at home, not to vote in this election. He's doing this consulta popular, which is supposed to be like a sort of a ghost election, a mirror election of what's going on, where people can vote using their smartphones, but it doesn't really appear to be taking off too well. And also, there's a lot of people on social media showing how that even non-Venezuelans are able to vote in these things. So inside Venezuela, he's not a particularly popular character, certainly not after his 5 coup attempts, all of which have been unsuccessful, some of them catastrophically so. But certainly in the US, he still has huge backing. He had bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. People might remember that in February, he was given a standing ovation by the Democrats and the Republicans at the State of the Union address. So the depiction of him in the United States doesn't really match how I think ordinary Venezuelans feel about him. Even somebody like Enrique Capriles, who used to be kind of associated with him, is now calling on the US just to stop funding him at all. So this election seems to have further created wedges between the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, and seems more or less to have been a small victory for the government.
Absolutely. And if we really want to talk about election meddling, I think Venezuela and how the United States is meddling in Venezuelan elections is a great example. And Anya, you've actually, you've been on the ground, you've been interviewing people on the streets. I just recently watched your really great coverage at the Gray Zone. Can you talk to me about, what's happening at these rallies? You've talked to people on the ground. What are they saying about the elections right now in Venezuela?
Well, Max and I had the opportunity to attend the closing rally of the PSUV party, the Socialist Party here in Venezuela, about 2 or 3 days before the vote actually took place. And I've certainly seen larger rallies in Venezuela, in Caracas, just because they're usually so massive. And I think due to the pandemic, there was a resistance to kind of rally in the streets the way PSUV is used to. There was actually a very strict lockdown here. in place in Venezuela, and then they've only recently started opening up with a sort of flexible schedule, week on, week off for certain businesses. So people are adjusting now to coming back into normal life, but there still was a sizable crowd out in the streets saying that they saw for the past 5 years what the agenda of the National Assembly led by the opposition was. They spent 5 years begging for sanctions against their own people from the United States, leading to massive suffering in the country. And they also implemented a direct coup attempt against the government. And so people had the chance to see that agenda, to experience it. And so it's no surprise really then that this program was rejected on Sunday when Venezuelans went to vote. And then on the actual day of the process, of the voting process, people were very enthusiastic and wanted to send a message to the United States. When we asked them, what is your message, that the United States should really be reflecting on its own system before it speaks about Venezuela. There was a really common point people would make, is that there's a sense that we didn't really know who the winner of the presidential election was in the United States until days after the vote. There are people still casting doubt on the results, including for some time the president himself, Donald Trump, claiming there was fraud without presenting any clear evidence, but that there was, due to the lack of the centralized system in the United States, an ability for the Trump administration to capitalize on questions people might have about the vote, and a lot of skepticism about the vote, that the people of the United States have a lack of confidence in their system. So what right does Washington have to point fingers at Venezuela when there are still serious questions raised about its own vote, which took place just last month?
Well, and we have politicians here that are insisting that Venezuela's voting system is completely rigged. It's illegitimate. And Adrienne, you are one of the 1,500 election observers there in Venezuela. Can you talk to us about the Venezuelan voting system? You've mentioned in the past that Venezuela's voting system is among the most advanced in the world. Can you explain that to us?
Sure, and it was really amazing to see it firsthand. I mean, there are so many sort of measures, fail-safe measures in the system and redundant measures to ensure that there can't be fraud, that, I mean, I was just blown away. So basically the way that it works, and we did a training the day before the actual elections and sort of went through every process. First, people check their names on the list outside of the ballot center to see which room that they will vote in. They go inside. They get sprayed at every process. This was one of the things that was fascinating, was that COVID biosecurity measures were completely integrated into the electoral voting system itself at every single step. So there was no step when they weren't being, sanitized and ensured that nobody was going to get COVID from this. So get sprayed, they go in, they first go to the desk where they register, and they do it one by one. There's a person at each station except for the actual voting booth who's there to help them. They give them their voter ID card. There is a contact-free little box for them to put it in, so the election worker doesn't have to touch it. They then enter in the number into a machine that's built just for this. A picture of the person comes up. They can compare the person with the picture on their machine, and then the person has to do an electronic thumbprint to ensure that they are in fact the same person, above and beyond the visual confirmation that the poll worker does. Once they are confirmed, then they go to the private voting booth. It's the vote is electronic, and so they vote for their individual candidates, and then they also vote for a party because there's both a representational parliamentarian system and a direct vote system in the current Congress. And so they fill out their ballot on the electronic system, and then that system prints out a receipt of their ballot. So it prints out a paper ballot from the ballot that's gone into the electronic system. They confirm that their vote is correct, that everything they vote, everything they put in there was correct. And then they fold that up and go over and put that into an actual ballot box. So it's doubly counted. The count is electronic, and that's immediate, obviously, but at the end of the day, all of the receipts in the ballot box are counted as an audit of the electronic system. And that count is done with multiple accredited monitors from all different parties. And there were 107 parties represented in the elections. This is an incredible plurality, a multi-party system, and parties that are vigorous, both ones that are friendly to the PSUV and ones that are in the opposition. And so there's this audit at the end of the day, multiple, it's public, these citizens who are accredited are able to watch it. And then just in terms of the end, they have a checkout process at the end. So there's all these steps when it's impossible for somebody who is not accredited or who is not a registered voter to vote. And there's this fail-safe to ensure that that the vote is going to be accurate. None of the sort of ridiculous multiple systems, hanging chads, different state-by-state procedures, or methods to suppress the vote that we have in the United States. It was truly impressive.
That's amazing. And it just goes to show how much propaganda the corporate mainstream media spews, and just how much people believe this kind of reporting that's coming out of these stenographers within Western corporate media. Alan, you've been covering Western coverage of Venezuela for a long time now. Talk to me about some of the stenographers within Western corporate media and how they are covering Venezuelan elections, like that of The Guardian or the New York Times. Could you give us some specific examples?
Yeah, well, Adrienne's laid out how the election actually works. But regardless of who wins the election, it seems, every time there is one in Venezuela, the corporate media in the West, anyway, do not think it has been a free and fair election. And this is often over and above the objections even of US or Washington-backed, Washington-paid-for groups that go to these places and then look at the elections and rubber stamp them as being free and fair. So, for instance, the Carter Center has been to Venezuela many times and said that the election process is the most advanced in the world. Jimmy Carter famously said that in 2012. And yet even liberal outlets like The Guardian or the New York Times will call these elections a sham, the coronation of a dictator. And, even just across the border in Colombia, they have elections where, certain candidates are, suffer assassination attempts, and there are paramilitaries terrorizing the population. But these are seen as basically steps forward for democracy. So there's always a double standard when it comes to Venezuela, and that's precisely because of what sort of government it has. It's a government that doesn't really toe the line when it comes to what Washington dictates.
And Max, perhaps you could give us just a brief history, if you will. I know there's been a lot going on, but maybe just a brief history of why exactly Venezuela has been such a target of this regime change campaign for several decades.
Well, clearly it's just because, it's so corrupt and the US wants to just save people from corruption. They really just care about the Venezuelan people so much. That was kind of the explanation I got from a major mainstream US reporter who I spoke to before a press conference of Nicolas Maduro 2 days ago, that, sanctions really aren't the issue. It's just corruption, mismanagement. But the US has sought to depose Venezuela's Bolivarian revolutionary government that came into power through democratic means since Hugo Chavez won in 1998, and return Venezuela to the kind of Fourth Republic system of neoliberalism, technocracy, and implementation of a sort of two-party duopoly. This might sound familiar to Americans, where basically two centrist parties exchanged hands and implemented IMF plans. But that wasn't popular among Venezuelans, who were just simply being starved. Over 50% of the country was excluded for reasons of racism, reasons of, just excluding poor people, class. And so you've seen the development of the country along what Hugo Chavez, the late revolutionary leader and president who served several terms, called 21st century socialism. The US just simply wants to get its hands back on one of the largest supplies of oil in the world. In addition, there are massive reserves of gold, aluminum, and so many other natural resources that the US and its allies would like to exploit. The UK would also like to exploit a disputed region between Venezuela and Guyana, which is rich with oil as well and prime for oil exploration. So it's a very simple story about the US and Exxon wanting to get back into an economy where a revolutionary government, which is socialist and aspires to be as democratic as it can be under siege, has exploited the resources for the benefit of the population. Currently, there are 3.3 million homes that are provided for free to Venezuelans. I mean, the 300,000th, I think, was built this year, which is a huge landmark in this mission program. There are 3 million families in Venezuela, which is a large portion of the population, served by the CLAP food program, which basically provides free food for people and sanitary supplies. There are these food markets that are presided over by municipal governments across Venezuela, which serve people who are at the bottom of the poverty level and middle class people, and provide them with all sorts of food. I've visited them. We've reported on them at the Gray Zone for below market value. All of this is taking place to help the nation survive under these brutal sanctions, which are aiming to prevent oil exports. So Venezuela is starved of assets. So it basically can't buy food. Even the CLAP program that I mentioned is being sanctioned. One of the key figures who is gone around the world and gone to Europe to try to secure deals to provide food for import, Alex Saab, was actually kidnapped by the US through the Interpol program that it substantially controls. And Saab was tortured into a confession that he refused to make. And now he's under house arrest. So this is just a war on the whole Venezuelan people. And it's resulted in a landmark law that was passed somewhat hastily through the Constituent Assembly, called the Anti-Blockade Law. This law is really significant because it represents an opening up of the economy. Some critics would call it liberalization, but it's what the Venezuelan government has had to do in order to bring in new capital. And it's opening up sectors of the economy outside of the oil sector for exploitation and investment by foreign investors. The government here just hosted scores of Chinese businessmen, and these deals are going to help the government survive this siege. In fact, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a think tank in Washington that has helped organize the coup on Venezuela, conceded in an article 7 days ago that the anti-blockade law will make it much more difficult for the US to enact a quote unquote democratic transition, which means a transition back to those old neoliberal governments that provoke catastrophe. So, and you actually see the economic situation has improved a little bit since I've been last here, but it's still very problematic in the countryside. Services are not where they should be, but the government is enacting a pragmatic program. It's caused a minor conflict with what I would call the ultra left, and a number of candidates broke off into a kind of ultra-left factional party running under the Communist Party's banner instead of the PSUV banner in this election. And they achieved basically 2% of the vote, which shows how their vision was sort of rejected by the mass of Chavistas. And just one final point here about the economic transition into a kind of more mixed economy. Many critics of Nicolas Maduro, who presided over this transition, say this is not Chavismo. This is not the 21st century of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez died before the full-scale economic attack of the US began, before the sanctions came in first under the Obama administration with the national security threat listing in 2015. I think Hugo Chavez was a very pragmatic figure who would do whatever it took to provide for his constituents and Venezuelans in general and prevent the kind of regime change catastrophe that he opposed early on when he was one of the first major figures in the world to stand beside Syria's government and Libya's government against these regime change operations. And so this government is doing what it's had to do to move through various phases of a hybrid war. And so far it has come out on top. It seems to be victorious, but not without significant damage to the economy, which is what happens when the empire is holding you under a full court press.
Absolutely. And you know, what's pretty incredible about this whole situation with Venezuela feeding its population, like right now, amid this global pandemic, we have lines to food banks, in the United States, literally running miles long because people are really struggling to put food on their table. We have, over 40 million people that have applied for unemployment, while the richest, Americans, the billionaire class, the 1% billionaires class, are accruing more wealth in American history than any time. So it's just such a contrast to see how one country who is sanctioned, how they're reacting in this pandemic and treating their citizens and feeding their citizens. Meanwhile, we have here in the United States, our politicians are debating whether they should send out these $1,200 checks for each American when like millions of people are struggling to pay for their rent and their mortgages. But then, Congress just approved $740 billion for the military. So such a contrast to see. And Anya, I want to talk to you, I would like to ask you about the 100,000 deaths that are a result of US sanctions that have been called a crime against humanity. And Max, you definitely explained that very, very well. Anya, could you explain what everyday life is like under sanctions in Venezuela?
Certainly, there's no denying that sanctions are impacting the situation here. There are, in some areas, extremely long lines for fuel. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world, and yet sanctions have prevented the country from keeping its facilities and its ability to process its oil. It's prevented them from the upkeep and getting the parts that they need in order to do that. And actually, up until last year, when this new round of sanctions came from the Trump administration, Venezuela received light crude from the United States. That's because much of the crude here is heavy and it needs to be mixed and processed in order to actually be used as fuel in cars. And that's really hurt this situation here. That's why we saw earlier this year, Iran actually step in and provide some of that light fuel the United States previously provided here in Venezuela. And over 4 or 5 shipments now have come from Iran. I mean, across the world, from the other side of the world, in order to break this medieval style siege of Venezuela. And that happened despite naked threats from the United States. The United States stationed Navy warships in the Caribbean Sea as an open threat against the Venezuelan state, but also any of its allies, which were brave enough to break the blockade, as Iran did. And so we have seen lines for fuel, also lines for cooking oil, but there is a massive effort on behalf of the government and its international allies to respond to this crisis. And what's remarkable, Manar, is that yes, we've seen a massive amount of unnecessary deaths due to the sanctions, due to the fact that Venezuela can't even buy basic medications such as for example, insulin as a result of US unilateral coercive measures imposed on the country. And yet in the midst of an international pandemic, Venezuela has actually fared better than most, if not all, of its neighbors, whether that's Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru. All of these nations have experienced intense suffering as a result of the pandemic. And I guarantee you, if, for example, people were dying in the streets of Venezuela and their bodies were being left the way we saw images coming out of Ecuador, if that were happening here, it would be on the front page or the top stories in US media. And yet we haven't seen those images. Why is that? Well, it's because due to the fact that Venezuela is an independent country which has forged relationships with its international partners in spite of US sanctions, it was uniquely poised to respond to the crisis, while countries such as Brazil and the coup government in Bolivia had kicked out Cuban doctors. Venezuela had brigades of Cuban medical teams ready and available to visit people in their homes when they registered symptoms online. There's a very intense process here with testing. Tests are readily available and free. People receive free medical care. The government used buildings and dormitories and schools and hotels and opened them as quarantine hospitals, again, where people could stay for free. And on top of that, while U.S. allies in the region were completely abandoned by the United States, which is experiencing the worst COVID outbreak in the entire world, Venezuela was able to import tests and medical supplies from Russia, from Iran, from China. Tons and tons of medical equipment and much needed supplies, which actually enabled them to respond to the pandemic more effectively and efficiently than its neighbors in spite of US sanctions. And I think that fact, this experience has really demonstrated to the world what the future will look like. It's the United States. It's the most powerful empire to ever exist in the history of the world. It can wage an unbelievable amount of harm and stress upon its perceived enemies, such as Venezuela. It could cause fuel shortages. It can implement criminal sanctions. But at the end of the day, there is this new world emerging. I should mention that even a NATO ally, Turkey, has forged very strong relations with Venezuela and actually supplies some of the products in the CLAP food program Max mentioned. Iran opened a supermarket here in Venezuela recently, Megasis, which we plan on visiting and getting a better picture of what that market looks like. But there is a war. There's an economic war the U.S. has waged on Venezuela, and it's done a lot of damage, but it's also waged this same maximum pressure campaign against Iran, against Russia, and against so many other countries in the world that are now coming together in order to say, well, we can build a system outside of the United States and it can actually succeed.
Absolutely. And, you know, Anya, everything's just going to be okay, right? Because Trump is out of office now and we have Joe Biden from the Democratic Party. So, you know, didn't you get a sign of relief when he was elected?
Totally right. He was so great for Latin America when he was vice president under the Obama administration and oversaw coups in Honduras, in Paraguay, in Brazil, and really took credit for Plan Colombia, which has militarized the region and led to immense suffering in Latin America. So no, people here are under no illusions about what a Biden administration means for them.
Absolutely. And Adrienne, I'd like to ask you this, and this is related to what I just talked to Anya about. You know, while the Trump administration has ramped up aggressive actions against Venezuela, increasing sanctions, supporting coups, and funding political parties. Not that it was any different under Obama or, you know, Bush before them, but the Democratic Party platform even commits the party to pursuing regime change under Biden in Venezuela once he's in office, which is incredible how that's just stated, straightforward like that. Do you see any major changes for Venezuela in the future, especially with regards to the United States?
You know, what's interesting is President Maduro has been stating in his press conferences and elsewhere that he is hoping for a change in policy. But I mean, I think, to be honest, we know there's not going to be a change in policy coming from Biden. Biden is just as much of a hawk, if not more so, as Trump, in particular with regard to Venezuela. So whereas Biden might have a less draconian policy toward Cuba, for example, there's a possibility that he could go back to the Obama era opening, which was also just a neoliberal attempt at regime change, as opposed to the sanctions, the approach that Republicans have pushed more for Cuba. Everything Biden has said, you know, he's called Maduro a thug. He's supported the sanctions, and this is something, you know, that except for, you know, really, I mean, just, I don't think there's any Democrat that has forcefully spoken out in support of Venezuelans' right to sovereignty. We saw with I think Alan mentioned that Juan Guaido, who is just completely a laughingstock, as we've discussed, within Venezuela, was invited to the State of the Union and given a standing ovation by Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, who was standing there and doing her clap. That, you know, that makes Democrats feel like she's such a queen and everything, just giving their full support. Another thing to note is that during Biden's campaign, his whole strategy for the quote unquote Latino vote, which of course we know is a much more diverse vote than can be encapsulated within this overarching category, it was entirely geared toward the ultra right wing elite Miami base of Venezuelans and Cubans, you know, and right-wing Nicaraguans. So that, you know, and it failed miserably, but nonetheless, those are the people like Ana Navarro, who is an open Contra supporter to this day, who have been the main advisors and the people who call themselves Latinos for Biden. And so his policy has been completely informed by this reactionary neoliberal fascist, very small part of what represents the broader Latino community in the United States, if we're going to call it that, and also is a slap in the face to the Latinx organizers around the country who organized so hard to get Trump out, that he really can thank his victory in Arizona, for example, to those individuals who were fighting for immigration rights rather than, you know, this sort of ideas about regime change that Biden is catering to. So, you know, really the only hope for solidarity from the United States is, I think, going to be dramatically pressuring the Biden regime from grassroots movements, and solidarity work from social movements within the United States, and sort of bi-directional solidarity, Venezuelan social movements, US social movements, that really recognize that the violence that we face here in the United States, and in particular the communities of color, that Black communities, that Indigenous communities, and many other non-white communities face, is completely parallel to the violence that Venezuelans are facing under US sanctions. We're seeing the exact same processes. We're seeing the privatization of everything. We're seeing the usurpation of democracy. If you look at Flint, Michigan, for just to take one example, the appointing of a city manager is basically a coup. It's taking away people's right to democracy, and the health impacts of that have been completely dramatic. The police, the militarization and police violence, the attacks on communities of color are akin to the United States sanctions, and the added to this hybrid warfare, the militarization, the military attacks on Venezuela. So if we begin to see these connections between the violence of the US empire at home and its violence abroad, I think that's where the possibility for achieving a better policy lies. But we cannot count on Biden for anything. We'd be fooling ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I hope everyone, you know, sensed my sarcasm when I asked that question about Biden. Max, if you will explain to our listeners the benefit that the United States gets, apart from the very obvious, control factor of supporting these right-wing groups across the world, whether it comes to Brazil, Bolivia, or in Venezuela, or in Syria, or arming literal Nazis in the Ukraine. What benefit does the United States have from this, and where does this strategy stem from? Like, where does the root of this strategy come from when it comes to how the U.S. approaches arming and funding these right-wing groups?
Well, all of these elements have different characteristics, these right-wing elements. I can tell you that from my understanding of the situation here and in Syria, there's a very good working relationship between although the Venezuelan government is dramatically different from the kind of Ba'athist system in Syria. The two governments coordinate on intelligence, diplomacy. They learn lessons from one another because both of them are targets of U.S. hybrid warfare from all sorts of adversaries. The role that Colombia plays against Venezuela as kind of a base for operations, harboring refugees and using refugees as a political weapon, harboring proxy militant groups, is the same role that Turkey played during the proxy war on Syria. And so they've exchanged lessons from one another, and the Venezuelans understand what took place in Syria on a very intimate and detailed level. And these right-wing groups exchange lessons too. I reported in 2013 on how the right-wing Miami Cuban lobby was actually holding training sessions with the Syrian opposition. And that extends all around the world to US proxies, which are used to kind of keep the US's hands clean politically, but to destabilize countries through groups that are completely dependent on outside funding, outside arms and training. So I could draw a parallel, even though there is no real armed wing of the arsonist Guaido opposition right now. I could draw a clear parallel between that and the so-called Free Syrian Army, which was basically a CIA-created brand for a weapons farm for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. What happened with the Free Syrian Army? Well, it was pretty clear. It's become pretty clear. You have 21 of the 26 factions that have been repurposed into the Turkish Free Syrian Army, which has been deployed into Nagorno-Karabakh in what is effectively Armenian territory to assist the Azerbaijani slash and burn campaign. We've seen these mercenaries also deployed to Afrin in northern Syria to purge the area of Kurds. They've been used basically as a proxy by Erdogan and the AKP party since the CIA basically cut them loose. And they've been revealed as just complete mercenaries who will fight for whoever's paying and arming them. It's the same thing with Guaido and his group, which is basically subsisting on a U.S. gravy train and is taking the most extreme line because the U.S. pays them on the basis that they push regime change, destabilization, sanctions, and are willing to hurt their fellow countrymen and women. So Vanessa Newman, who Alan can talk about a lot, was the fake ambassador for the Guaido coup administration to the UK. She was involved. She's basically, we've written about her at the Gray Zone. She's basically this ultra wealthy socialite and heiress who used to date Mick Jagger, who got involved with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington and started pushing all these bogus stories about Venezuela being a base for Hezbollah and helping to kind of bring in pro-Israel elements to the anti-Chavista operation and so on. But she was involved in this case, this major landmark legal case in the UK around the Bank of England seizing something like, $8 billion in Venezuelan gold because the Venezuelan government had parked its assets in the bank, assuming, well, they're a bank, they can't just steal it from us. But then Guaido comes in, Vanessa Newman's the ambassador, she's in charge of that. And the bank ruled that Vanessa Newman was going to have to pay her own legal fees, tons of legal fees. Tens of millions. And so she quit as ambassador because the money was no longer coming in. And that's where these characters are at. Basically, a bunch of mercenaries who are at the end of the line here. And what we're going to see with Guaido's team is the same thing we've seen with so many of these other proxy forces, like the Cubans who failed in the Bay of Pigs. They basically became absorbed into the US political structure and became an extremist, domestic, kind of an extremist pressure group, exile lobby in Florida. And I think that, just to close, they played a big role in winning Florida for Trump. What's known as kind of the Magazuelans. You'll see them on social media. They'll be like the most hysterical figures you'll meet, and they don't really reflect the views of the kind of patriotic opposition here at all. They've basically given up on their country, and they just want a campaign of arson to burn it all down. They helped Trump win Florida. They've completely invested in Trump. They've joined up with right-wing Colombians there, the right-wing Cuban lobby, right-wing Nicaraguans. Miami-Dade used to be a Democratic bastion. It's now kind of going Republican because of this new lobby. And the Democrats don't have to pay attention to it because they won Georgia. They won several other swing states. Texas is sort of trending blue. And so while I don't expect anything from Biden, given the history that Adrienne and Anya laid out really well, if the Democrats would pay less attention to Florida, stop bringing people like Ana Navarro around, and start actually, focusing on the more progressive elements of their base, they might not have to take such a strong line as Trump did, when Trump really couldn't have cared less about toppling Maduro. He was going to probably meet with him if he won another term, but he wanted to win a second term. He wanted to win Florida. So I think there are a lot of elements in play here with the Venezuelan Guaido opposition getting so extreme that do create some political opportunities domestically in the US.
And I appreciate everybody being here as we break through the propaganda machine in terms of Venezuela coverage. And I just want to wrap up with this last question for Alan, if you can just kind of give us a 2-minute synopsis of, you've been covering Western media coverage of Venezuela, and, we all here work in independent and alternative media. Alan, what do you think the best thing for people to do to continue to break through the propaganda machine when it comes to US foreign policy, when it comes to Venezuela, considering how much censorship is taking place and control over our news feeds by the establishment today?
Yeah, I mean, I've been studying how journalists from big outlets like CNN or The Guardian come to Venezuela and report on it. And what became clear after actually interviewing them is that they see themselves as mercenaries who are kind of like the shock troops, literally trying to overthrow the government. Some of them even said it pretty much explicitly to me on camera. And so when we're really looking at countries like Venezuela, I think it's important to understand the biases of certain sources and try to look around for different media outlets, perhaps foreign media in English or alternative media, and you'll see a vastly different picture being presented. And it's at that point that you can start really seeing what's going on here and start making decisions for yourself about what's really going on. So I suppose with any question about the media, I'd always say try and support independent media, try and look for other voices that are perhaps out of the mainstream and try and support them if you like them.
Absolutely. And I appreciate every single one of you for being here with me today. I'm very proud of this panel that we put together. You can find the MintCast podcast on our website and on YouTube. Thank you so much.